This is a prologue of a book called Bernice Between the Lines by ancestor of mine, Bernice Morris, who was a member of the Communist Party of Australia. This was written in 1915. It's from the National Library of Australia. And of course, she's long gone. And my dad was sort of had a big interest in the Communist Party, and a lot of people in the trade union movement understand how important the Australian Communist Party was in kicking the union movement in the arse and being very motivated. And without the Australian Communist Party, the union movement would have been weak as piss, I imagine. That would be a fair statement. Prologue. In December 1968, I was living with my two sons in Moscow. We were about to celebrate our 10th Christmas abroad, and our first without Dave. That was our husband. So Bernice Morris was married to David Morris, the great uncle, great auntie and uncles of mine, or great I think would be better to say. Acting under some compulsion or other, I have made Christmas cakes and puddings back in November. Then I invited some known lovers of pudding to come for Christmas dinner. There were 10 of us all together. We didn't bother with a tree, but strung some festoons of dancing Ukrainians below the ceilings and put red candles on the table, set in tastefully carved radishes for want of candlesticks. We had mushroom soup, turkey and vegetables, and pudding with hard sauce, after which everyone was replete. We presented the ladies with small bottles of perfume, and the gents with back scratches. My youngest son, Len, raced in with the plates, and the elder Paul felt moved to take them out and wash them. I had worked hard the week before and put some effort into this dinner. After all, I hauled down the decorations and lapsed into gloom at the New Year, which everyone in Moscow celebrates wildly. Approached. It had not been a good year for me, but I did not want to part with it. In April, 1 week before his 58th birthday, my husband Dave had succumbed to cancer. Paul, Len and I honoured him for the manner in which he'd stuck to his political convictions throughout his life and his fortitude in bearing pain at its end. Always a student, he had turned in his later years to writing, even managing to type while lying in a plaster cast. His body was cremated. Look, I'll skip a bit of that because the intro explaining the times, how difficult it was around the time of the First World War. Part 1, the early years. This is very interesting as well. The girl from the bush. I was not there, but this is how it would have been. George and Daisy McCoy rose at daybreak. It was late February and the day was bound to be hot. They wanted to make an early start. It was a long way to Miller, some miles across the border into New South Wales, when George's sister and her husband lived. George fed the horse and harnessed it in the sulky and let the calf out of its pen so it could run with its mother while he was away. Daisy prepared breakfast and packed a bit of lunch and breakfast over. She washed the dishes, raked back the coals in the stove, and swept the kitchen floor. She made a bundle of things she had prepared for the baby and her stay in hospital. After securing the doors with the homemade latches, she went out to the sulky. George had built their small house, 2 rooms and a skilling made out of timber and bark taken from the nearby forest, and had also made most of the furniture. The house, like dozens of others belonging to settlers, sat snugly along on a few acres of cleared land near Chandler's Creek in eastern Victoria. No road past its front gate, but a track to the west led to Nuremberg, a settlement 15 miles away. George helped Daisy into the sulky and they set off for Miller. He pulled up outside a house a mile or so up the track, where his parents lived with their 3 unmarried sons. George went inside to ask his brother to keep an eye on his property until he got back. Daisy hoped they could stop reading long enough to do as he asked. They were always reading. If she had her way, she would throw the books out. Thank goodness George was a good worker. Still, she had to admit that his brother had built the house for the old people and made a good job of it, and he had found the plans and specifications for it in a book. Daisy was still a very young woman, short and slight, with small hands and feet. Her eyes were large, grey and beautiful, a fact of which she was well aware. Her straight nose was slightly freckled, and her cheeks bright pink. Once she washed her face in front of some cousin who was surprised that the colour did not come off. Just as well they were not watching me, she said, or they would have told people I painted. Now as they jogged along the hot sun, her cheeks got redder and the curls fringing her face became damp with sweat. She tried to dismiss the fears besetting her at the prospect of the coming ordeal. It was late when they reached Miller. George stayed for 2 days to make sure that Daisy was in good spirits and to rest his horse before returning to Chandler's Creek. His brother-in-law would take Daisy to the hospital at Bombala for confinement. I was the child Daisy brought into a world at war on 11th of March 1915. When the news was telephoned to George, he jumped on his horse and kept riding till he reached the hospital. People referred to George McCoy as the handsome youth, but he was by then 35 years old, nearly twice the age of his wife. A gentle, taciturn man to grumbling, he never felt the words to express his fondness for Daisy. By mischance of perverted sense of humour, he would end up saying the opposite of what he meant. When Daisy brought some bright cretonne from an Indian hawker and made curtains for a modest home, George would likely as not respond with it. I suppose a sugar bag would serve the purpose as well. The usually irrepressible Daisy would feel crushed for a while anyway. Dad was very like mother, Alan McCoy. Both were tall, thin and patient, but unlike Dad, Grandma still seemed never to smile. Maybe this was because she had so many disappointments. Born into a reasonably well-to-do family from Braidwood, some miles north of Bombala, she had trained as a teacher. She had met Patrick McCoy when she was appointed as the first woman teacher at the Cathcart School. Patrick lived on a large family farm at Cathcart and appeared to be a young man with good prospects. When they were married, a second house was built for them on the McCoy property. But Patrick's brother also married and settled on the farm, and the land could not support so many. A large leased area was lost and imprudent cattle deals made, so that by the time the 1890s depression struck, the family had become impoverished. In 1898, Patrick and Alan, with their 6 children, left to become share farmers, receiving only 3p a gallon for milk. That sounds like fuck all. There was little improvement in their lot. They moved to a small farm at Rockton, but could only eke out a meagre living there. Finally, they settled at Chandler's Creek, where they lived in a subsistence level on a small farmlet, and their sons worked as casual labourers. I can remember Dad's brother, Lou, carrying me on his shoulders as we crossed the Chandler Creek. This was just before he went to the war, where he was killed. Small wonder Grandma didn't smile. Grandma was skilled at tatting and making baskets from the grasses that grow on the Monaro Plateau, and for me she made an endless supply of rag dolls, always replacing their dirty faces with new, clean ones. Adversity had not robbed Grandfather of laughter. He was always ready for a joke and a drink. On our visits, I used to sit on his knee and endlessly wind his watch. I was 5 when I became ill, and his sons carried me back to the farm at Cathcart on a litter they'd made. Grandma moved to Cathcart to be with him and stayed until he died of cancer 2 years later. Okay, I was 5 when he became ill. I might have said I was 5 when I became ill. Anyway, Daisy's parents, Orlando and Francis Pedersen, had selected land at Cairn River during the 1880s. Their parents had bought land along the Nicholson River 20 years earlier and raised large families. It was these children who settled Cairn River. After a few years, Orlando, having decided the valley had become too congested, moved with his family to Buldar, a tiny basin in the mountains 7 miles from Chandler's Creek. It was there that Greta Cecilia, pet named Daisy, grew up. Her tutors were her elder sisters, who in turn had been taught by some scholarly but impoverished person willing to give lessons for £1 a week and his keep. When the girls had grown into young women, they each paid a lengthy visit to their many relatives living along the Nicholson River, where they learned housewifely skills and accomplishments such as painting and playing the organ, usually hymns. When she returned from a visit to her Nicholson River relatives, Daisy met George McCoy and his brothers, who had come to do some fencing on the Pedersen property after bushfire had swept through. She and George married a few months later. My mother was to make the arduous trip to the Bala hospital 3 more times after my birth. For Peter 2 years later, Cavell in 1921 and Francis in 1922. Our brother Patrick was born in Abbas because the New South Wales border was closed during the 1919 influenza epidemic. A good time was a bad time. Mum always said about giving birth. She would have been well content with 2 children, but by the time she was 27 she had 5, in spite of having tried every method of birth control of which she had heard. In the end she locked the bedroom door. We all lived in the little house. By the time of Francis' arrival was very crowded. Once a week Mum bored up the copper, and in the evening we all bathed in a tub before the fire, lathering ourselves as best we could with homemade soap. So then once a week they had a hot bath. On Sundays, barefoot but clean, we would walk up the track to see Dad's parents. Dad could put his hand to anything, but he had not been trained in any trade, though his education was modest. Like the other McCoys, he was a reader. His favourite authors were Henry Lawson and Charles Dickens, both too depressing for Mum. When after the war preference was given to ex-servicemen, he was doubly disadvantaged in the search for work. When he did get a job, it often took him far from home. During these absences, Mum lived in a fear of tramps. On the Nuremberg side of the track, our nearest neighbour 3 miles away always phoned to say when a tramp was coming. If he had been described as cheeky, Mum would bake bread and place a loaf of butter, jam and eggs for him on the gate post and a note telling him to take it. If he was making her way towards the house, she would gather us around and hide among the bushes. Sometimes her heart thumped so loudly she was afraid he would hear. Mum had been a strong woman, talented and full of energy. She did not have to milk the cows as fast as she did, saw through enormous logs, pick 8 bags of maize in a day, or dig heaps of potato. But these Herculean tasks were her only means of self-expression. After her 5th child, her body could no longer take the punishment of heavy farm work. It was many months after Francis was born before Mum recovered her strength. I was not yet 8, but I quickly learned to bathe and feed the baby and exercise some authority over my brothers. But perhaps worse for Mum was then the physical fatigue, were her growing anxieties about our future. What was to become of a tribe of children? Were they to grow up illiterate with no training for useful work? She wanted her children to be skilled tradesmen, even her girls in that farming district. She did not want us to learn to milk cows. By 1924 she had other plans. During the early 1920s, the track from Nuremberg to Chandler's Creek had been improved and made into a gravel road, and bridges were built over the creeks. These signs of progress gave Mum an idea. She decided that they would sell the farm and build a boarding house near the store and the post office at Nuremberg. The Nuremberg settlement served the material and spiritual needs of the farmer and the others who dwelled along the 20-mile stretch of the Cairn River Valley. It boasted a Methodist church, a mechanics institute, a school, showgrounds, and 2 tennis courts. The farm and stock was sold, and the money raised went towards buying materials for the boarding house. A dad and a carpenter built on 1.5 acre site, 11 rooms, a large veranda on 3 sides. By the time it was finished, Mum owed the storekeeper about £300, but boarders flocked in as well at overnight travellers, and people just wanted a meal. The Methodist minister, the local teacher, and Truny who worked at the store were permanent boarders from time to time. There would be shearers, drovers, and rabbit trappers staying for a few days, and commercial travellers and tourists for overnight accommodation. These people, with their tall tales, jokes, views, and news, gave us a line of communication with the outside world. A good manager and no stranger to hard work. Mum sped through the rooms, changing bed linen, filled up water jugs, emptying chamber pots, putting candles in the candle holders, and sweeping the floors. Then the copper was boiled, the sheets hung out in a seemingly unending line, and it was time to get lunch. She was a slim, pretty vivacious 38-year-old. Every afternoon she bathed and changed into one of the half-dozen or so brief sheets she owned, added a string of red, yellow, or blue beads, powdered her face, brushed her shingled hand, waited for compliments. There was always some itinerant worker or commercial traveller ready to pay them. "Your daughter will never be as pretty as her mother," they would tell her, and she would glow with unashamed pleasure. Flirting is the best indoor sport, she maintained. We were very different. I seemed the older one. She would have liked me to be pretty and frivolous. I've liked to have more staid and dignified like other mothers. Bernice wants me to wear jet beads and black dresses, she often lamented. After Mum had served the evening meal, we called it tea and went into the sitting room to read the paper, play 500 or drafts, and talk, or rather listen. She loved to hear other people's stories, Few emerged from such a confrontation without confining all their secrets. The dark colours she had chosen for the sitting room, olive green walls and maroon frieze, served as a perfect foil for her bright dresses and personalities. If there was no one to talk to, there was the wireless, a marvellous apparatus, actually full of wires and powered by 6 large batteries. We children always had to do the washing up after tea, but after that we too could listen. When the Test cricket matches were being played, we could sit up all night, unaware that the play was stimulated. What did it matter anyway if we won? We could go up to the store and gloat over poor Mr. Herbert, who was a pommy and proud of it. We heard Dame Nellie Melba singing God Save the King, at the opening of Parliament in Canberra. We now felt even more part of the wider world, especially since the Cann River Valley Highway had been gravelled and was the shortest route to the nation's capital. The move to Nuremberg had also meant we could go to school for the first time. Mum had tried unsuccessfully to teach me to read. I could copy script into longhand, but I knew not a word I wrote except that I was 9 years old on the first Monday in April 1924. Peter, Pat and I presented ourselves at Nuremberg School. Some 30 other pupils attended. We all filled in and sat 2 to a desk. There were 8 grades, but we all went free. I skipped that bit anyway. They're going on about blotting paper and 5 spitballs. On his return, the teacher would bound into the room, and all those out of their seats got the strap. We all observed this with fear. And they ran amok. No one did any lessons. The bigger children leapt over desks, fought each other, and fought with rulers or used spitballs. This is running amok with the teacher out of the room. That's a good bit, actually. Despite the disorder at school, we soon to learn. I was issued with a primer and taught the sound each letter made. I could soon read "the cat sat on the mat." To be able to make out all the sentences on the first page was sheer joy. I carried the primer around with me everywhere, sneaking little looks at each new page till I could read them. Then I first given the book I carried around too. I could read every story. At the end of the year, I went into grade 3. By 1926, I had completed my schooling up to grade 6, and the choices then were to do more years at the primary school or go on to high school. The nearest high school was in Albert, 60 miles away. Page 14. But at home, a crisis was developing between Mum and Dad. At the time we moved to Nuremberg, Dad began a new job in the forest, working for the Forestry Commission, which ironically is also where my grandfather works for the Forestry Department in Queensland. This was, I think they're talking about New South Wales, or Bala and those places. Nuremberg is New South Wales. In his day, he had broken in horses and become a shepherd, drover, shearer, fencer, and road maintenance worker. This new job was just right for him. He loved and guarded the forest as if it was his own garden. Soon he became a leading hand in the confidence of the forest office of someone whom he learned the botanical names of many of the trees and plants. Often he was required to work many miles from home, camping at the work site for a week, and then on a Saturday, after the morning's work, cycling home. On Sunday, he cut enough wood to keep the boarding house's fires burning for another week. Then he put a loaf of bread, hunk of corned beef, some eggs, a tin of jam, a few potatoes, butter, sugar and tea into a sugar bag, slung it over his shoulder and rode back to camp. He earned £4, 10 shillings a week, which he handed over to Mum, asking only for a few shillings for tobacco. The boarding house had done well. Mum felt she was a businesswoman living in a mansion, and unlike the isolation of the farm, was surrounded by people. One of the men boarding at our place was Herb from Wongarabel, ruddy complexioned. He was quite tall and beginning to thicken around the waist, so he was a bit fatty. I began to sense that he was more than just a casual friend of Mum, and I hated him. The feeling was mutual. I overheard him telling Mum I was so plain I'd never get a boyfriend. Oh, so this guy was getting it on with her mum. I was very fond of my father, and I suppose I saw this man as a threat to him. I loved my mother too, and realised how much we owed her. Without her energy and foresight and her hard work, we would all still be back at the Chandler's Creek. Our parents separated. We left the boarding house. Dad set up permanent camp in the forest. Mum, accompanied by her mother, took us to Bega to live. Mum's friend Herb did not accompany us. In fact, I don't think he ever visited us there. It seems Mum just wanted to see if she could manage on her own without a husband or admirer. In Bega she ran a boarding house for a short term, and then began a run-down lolly shop. The shop objective in moving from Can River was realised. I started at the Bega High Elementary School. How proud I was of my navy blue tonic and blazer. I fell in love with two of my teachers, beautiful young women from Sydney University, or so I thought. I enjoyed all the classes, even algebra, and after a year at the school I began to feel rather well educated in Bega. I knew there were pupils smarter than I was, but who at Nuremberg had ever been in a higher elementary school? I suppose Mr. Cameron had, because he let you know he had matriculated. Not that I even knew what that was or where he did it. Dad sent Mum every second cheque he earned, but she was always short of money. Her savings soon vanished, and the lodge shop never brought in much. In Bega, there was no store next door where you could buy things on tick. Often Mum gave me a shilling and a half, penny enough to buy 5 eggs for tea. She would make do on bread and butter, but she never allowed us to think we were poor people, just people temporarily short of money. That's interesting, isn't it? And each school holiday, my brother Peter and I went back to Nuremberg to see Dad. Mum somehow always found the money for our fares and accommodation for the two-day trip from Bega to Nuremberg. We travelled by service cars privately owned that carried passengers, sometimes mail. As we jolted over the corrugation on the gravel road, weary mile upon weary mile, I thought how lovely it would be if I were famous when we met with flowers and speeches of welcome. Delusion stuff there going on there. These dreams helped to blot out the sad fact that we were coming to cheer up our lonely, aging father, whom we loved as much as our young, troubled, striving mother. After 18 months in Bega, we returned to Nuremberg and the boarding house. Dad come back to live with us. It was just as well we were family again. We were then better able to withstand the economic depression which was about to engulf most of the world, not least the farmers and workers at the Can River Valley. It was not long before I saw the impact of the depression on people around me. Towards the end of 1929, I went to stay for a few months with a family in Mafra to attend a high school there. A friend's father lost his job and the family was forced to leave Mafra and moved to Melbourne into a rented house in Richmond. Only Kathy, who was under 21, found work. The 19 shillings a week she earned was all the family had to live on. Most portable things like the sewing machine and watches found their way to the pawn shop. The depression soon struck at our family. Dad lost his job in the forest and had to resort to maize picking and other casual work he could get on the farms. Mum did extra work at home, sorting hundreds of bags of beans at 5 shillings a bag. These were the beans that farmers grew for seed, and the broken, imperfect ones had to be sorted from the good. It was dreary work, and it took a day to sort a bag, but earned some money to pay the bills. There were still some boarders, though many of them failed to pay, and our bill at the store grew bigger and bigger. Anyway, I'll finish up in a sec. Mum always thought that paying your way equated to a good name, and a good name she was determined we all should have. As we turned 14 or had left school, we had to be responsible for our purchases. We had to open our own accounts at the store. The boys took poorly paid jobs on the farm. On the farms, I avoided that by working for Mum in return for food and clothing. Then, when I was 17, a phone call came from Malakuta. A waitress was wanted at Malakuta House for 3 months. Would I come? Malakuta House was owned by poet and author E.J. Brady, but his newly married daughter Tuppy and her husband Frank were running it. I wasn't sure what to expect, but it was something to do. I packed my case and went over on the service car. Tuppy had lived a life utterly different from mine. She was a socialist, a great reader, and possessed a righteous sense of humour. She was a most entertaining companion. One of the prettiest sights I can recall is Tuppy rowing across the lake at Malakula on a moonlit night. She was the cook, and I was the rest of the staff. As we never had many guests, life was just a frolic. Women were just beginning to wear slacks. Neither Tuppy nor I had slacks, but she 2 pairs of wide leg garments called house pyjamas. She wore 1 pair, and I wore the other. That's so good, isn't it? I better read another paragraph because it gets interesting. Among her friends were many writers and artists. I was enthralled with their stories about them. I met her sisters and one of her brothers. Compared to my stolid Methodist relatives, they were a bohemian lot and tantalizingly interesting. Tuppy nurtured my latent interest in the art and literature so that when I eventually gained access to the libraries, I knew which books I wanted to read. She was the first person I ever heard say a favourable word about the USSR and the Russian Revolution. I knew nothing about the USSR, but Tuppy's eloquence aroused my interest. I'd never heard dissenting views about anything, unless one counts the long discussions with my cousins about whether God made us or we were descended from monkeys. It was becoming obvious that there was more to know about the world than I could discover in Nuremberg. After 3 months, Malakula House closed. I went home, but I now looked at society with different eyes. What was the cause of all this worklessness and hunger? The Depression was a great leveller. Some of our relatives lost their farms, leaving them little better off than we were. Everybody was short of money, but with creditors at the store, money earned here and there by various members of the family, and growing some of our own food, none of us went hungry. Less fortunate folk tramped the roads, men sometimes accompanied by their wives and children, with chattels in handcarts straggled past the house month after month, year after year. Many knocked on our door and asked for food. None were turned away empty-handed. That's special, isn't it? The only government relief was a sustenance, a meagre sum for which the unemployed were required to work, including manual labouring on public works. My maternal grandmother still lived in Boulder, and there was no road into it, though Boulder had been settled for perhaps 30 years. Why not suggest building a road into Boulder? She thought provisions were still taken in by dray over track as they had been when she lived there as a girl. She and her sisters and brothers had ridden their horses wherever they wanted to go. Grandmother was long past riding horses to petition for a road. She and her youngest son went into Parliament House in Melbourne to see the representative for East Gippsland, and soon gangs of unemployed men on Susso came to build it. Many of them were unemployed accountants, solicitors and salesmen. Since the men had time on their hands, being required to work only a short week, many of them came to a place where they played cards or pedalled away at the Gobransian pianola. This pianola, which occupied a proud place in the sitting room, was a cause of some anxiety to us. For us, we were trampled for as well as those we tramped the roads, there were others, the commercial travellers who came in cars. They offered to sell, amongst other things, shares in gold mines, pine forests in New Zealand, blocks of land in Springvale, and pianolas on time payment. To Dad's dismay, Mum bought a pianola and then fell behind with the monthly repayments. She kept writing excuses, but the finance company became more and more insistent. I entered into the fray, dashing off an indignant letter of protest which silenced the hire purchase firm for months. I suppose the company realised it would cost more to repossess the pianola than it would to bring when resold. Of course, Mum paid for it as soon as she could. That'll do.